Welcome to the cutting edge of the global awakening.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex.
Well, it looks like the North Tower of the World Trade Center has just completely collapsed.
The U.S. dollar's status as the preeminent reserve currency is under attack.
This is a mathematical fact. Tens of trillions of dollars are being extracted from the United States of America.
You really want the truth? Then just follow the money.
Welcome to Follow the Money Radio, a broadcast dedicated to your personal, spiritual, and financial liberty. And now, here's your voice of reason in the midst of global chaos, economist and best-selling author, Jerry Robinson.
Friends, welcome to you all around the world. Welcome to Follow the Money Radio. So grateful to have you here today. Today we are going to be diving into a topic that's somewhat interesting, especially as we head into the 2020 election. And that topic, the title of today's podcast, is American Socialism 101. We find many people today who are worried about encroaching socialism in America, fear that we're going to see a communistic takeover or a Marxist takeover of the United States government. And today, the basic message of our podcast is that if you're worried about socialism coming to America, then you're a little too late. So let's dive into today's podcast and explain what we mean. So during the Ides of March 2019, the Trump administration released its proposed budget for fiscal year 2020. And under this new spending plan, the Trump White House forecasted that it would plan on spending $4.7 trillion. That's a lot of money, as you can imagine, $4.7 trillion. But their plan was to only take in $3.6 trillion during that same 12-month time period. So once again, Washington plans to saddle the American economy and, of course, you, the taxpayer, with yet another $1 trillion plus annual deficit. But that's not all. According to the new 2020 budget, the Trump administration forecast that these trillion-dollar annual deficits will continue into 2021 and again in 2022. And that's on top of the existing $1 trillion deficit that America has already added up in 2019. Now, all of this fiscal insanity would be comical if it weren't real money, and if our children and our grandchildren weren't the ones who will be stuck with the bill. Sadly, Washington's spending excess is indicative not of a nation on the ascent, but rather of a decadent empire in decline. America's national debt now stands well above a gargantuan $22 trillion. And it's rising by tens of billions of dollars each and every day. Add to that the projected $100+ trillion in unfunded liabilities for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and it's obvious that America has dug itself a hole that it can never get out of. And that's especially true considering that the U.S. cannot even sustain an average 3% GDP growth rate 10 years into the slowest economic recovery on record. In fact, recent economic forecasts released by the Federal Reserve reveal that America's supposedly robust economy is actually slowing at an accelerating pace. Last year, the Federal Reserve announced plans to raise interest rate targets at least 2 times in 2019 due to America's quote-unquote solid economic growth. But fast forward to today in October of 2019, and you'll find that the Federal Reserve has actually slashed interest rates twice. 2 major interest rate cuts in 2019, and more are likely ahead. Why has the Federal Reserve cut interest rates? Because America's economy, according to them, is simply too fragile to raise interest rates even once in 2019. In addition to making a sudden U-turn on its planned interest rate policy, the Fed has actually lowered its economic growth forecasts for America many times in recent months. In 2020, The Fed expects the U.S. to grow at a snail's pace of just around 2%. In 2021, that growth rate is expected to slow well below 2%, and even that sub 2% growth rate is expected to extend into 2022. Unfortunately, Trump's 2020 budget assumes a much higher 3.2% economic growth rate. So there's a large discrepancy between the Trump administration's wishful thinking about future economic growth and the Fed's more depressing figure of sub 2% economic growth. Will likely lead to even more explosive debt loads in the near term simply to compensate for the difference. Perhaps the only thing worse than America's astronomical debts and deficits is the general denial of their existence both by Washington and the American people. Despite the soaring debt levels and the general growing unease that we sense here in the economy, polls still show in the mainstream media that most Americans believe the economy is quote-unquote good, while only a minority of them believe that the economy is in poor shape. This is typical of our country's boom-bust economic cycle, where Americans largely live in denial about economic reality as long as the illusion of prosperity is propped up by the central authorities. However, when something goes wrong, like their 401k gets cut in half, or their IRA loses a tremendous amount of value, or their housing value dips, like we saw back in 2008, then suddenly they begin to wake up and demand that something be done. Rewind to the year 2009, for just a moment. At that time, the United States national debt was a mere $9 trillion. And I had a brand new book out called Bankruptcy of Our Nation. It was the very first edition. And I was being invited to speak at many Tea Party events organized by an outraged base within the GOP, which were determined to send a message to a broken Washington that its fiscal recklessness was unacceptable. At that time, the people had woken up to the reality of our broken government that has long been hijacked by corporate interests. They appeared to understand the true theft that was occurring as Main Street was being fleeced in order to bail out Wall Street. But 10 years later, political movements like the Tea Party have faded into oblivion. Just recently, the 10-year anniversary of the Tea Party was celebrated in Washington, D.C., and fewer than 200 people actually showed up to celebrate. And that should really come as no surprise, because after all, the American economy, we are told, has never been better. President Trump has dubbed this economy the greatest economy ever. Of course, such talking points are rooted in clever politicking and, quite frankly, simply delusions. Ironically, as the national debt and deficits have more than doubled in recent years, there is little to no outrage in 2019, especially among Republicans. Now, this, of course, should finally expose the ridiculous illusion that there is any meaningful difference between the Republican and Democratic political parties. America's two-party system is practically owned by corporate and other special interests, who in no way represent the will of the people, but rather the will of the elites. Alas, some will protest, adamantly suggesting that there is indeed a substantial difference between America's two political parties. Case in point, we are told, is the differing view on abortion held by the two parties. But this distinction, as well, is completely laughable, as Republicans held complete control over Washington, both the House and the Senate and the White House, and even a GOP-leaning Supreme Court from January 2017 to January 2019. During that time, what happened? Well, corporations got mega tax cuts, and America's largest socialist program, the United States military, got a massive boost in taxpayer dough. But the babies in the womb were paid little attention. If Republicans really wanted to end the practice of abortion, they had plenty of time and more than enough power to put a stop to it. Instead, they chose to pander to their naive base by using abortion as a political talking point for votes, and once in power, they ignored the issue as they always do. Ironically, the most vocal pro-life voters appeared to give the GOP a total pass for ignoring the topic of abortion, and instead spent their time defending Trump's sexual trysts. And the deluded masses are already lining up to believe the next round of lies and political propaganda as we head into the 2020 election. Aware that they can't use their abortion gimmick on GOP voters once again in 2020, Washington's Ever-clever political engineers have found exactly the right bait to ensnare the GOP's base once again. This time, instead of warning about endangered babies in the womb, or gays overtaking the military, or American Muslims who seek to express their God-given constitutional rights, the political propaganda will involve going after a much older foe, and that is socialism. As if the irony were not already thick enough, the GOP plans to revive the looming threat of socialism as one of their top political issues in the 2020 election. Now, the irony here, of course, stems from the fact that America, in many ways, has already adopted many socialist programs and institutions. You need proof? Well, first, perhaps a simple definition of socialism is in order. According to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, socialism is, and I quote, a way of organizing a society in which major industries are owned and controlled by the government rather than by individual people and companies. Therefore, at the most basic level, economic socialism involves any program or institution that is, one, involuntarily financed by the general population, and two, not privately owned by any individual or private entity, but instead owned and controlled by the government and existing for the public good. So let's begin by seeing if this definition applies to the United States military, which I've already brought up. Indeed, there may not be anything on earth closer to a socialist utopia than the United States military. This entirely government-run institution commits all of the sins that capitalists warn about. Free single-payer health care for all, free college tuition for all, free housing for all, free daycare for all working parents, rock-solid government-paid pensions for all, and much, much more, all to the tune of $700 billion or more per year. And by the way, that's all courtesy of the U.S. taxpayer. According to decorated four-star General Wesley Clark, the U.S. military is, quote, the purest application of socialism there is, unquote. For those who are eager to overthrow socialism, they may want to first reconsider what that might mean for the U.S. military. Indeed, it would appear to be far too late to be worried about the spread of socialism in America. Consider, Social Security itself is a socialist scheme. When Social Security was first introduced back in the 1930s, Republicans put up a fierce fight against the old age pension program, likening it to slavery and dictatorship. Representative James W. Wadsworth, a Republican from New York, warned that the passage of Social Security would provide the federal government with a power, quote, so vast, so powerful as to threaten the integrity of our institutions and pull down the pillars of the temple upon the heads of our descendants, unquote. The answer to whether Social Security is a socialist program was clear to Republicans from the very beginning, as the answer is right in the program's very name, Social Security. Social Security, of course, involves the involuntary extraction of money from taxpayers to the government. You have no choice. The government then redistributes this money according to a standard determined by Washington for the public good. Yep, that fits the definition of socialism, as there is nothing voluntary or privately owned about the Social Security system. How about Medicare? Is Medicare a socialist system? Well, of course it is. At least Ronald Reagan believed so whenever he fought tooth and nail against it back in 1961. According to Ronald Reagan, I quote, one of the traditional methods of imposing statism or socialism upon a people has been by way of medicine. And he goes on to state that if Medicare passes into law, the consequences would be dire beyond imagining, because from Medicare, it's a short step to all the rest of socialism. Pretty soon, the government will determine your son's pay. It will determine whether he can go to school and which school he can go to and where he can go and what he will do for a living. Indeed, Medicare is literally the single-payer form of health care for all that capitalist-loving Americans all claim to fear and dread. Again, its funding is involuntarily extracted from the public and then redistributed according to the government's wishes for the public good. That is socialism, pure and simple. And what about minimum wage and child labor laws? Are these socialist schemes? Well, of course they are. Ironically, even devout capitalists think that the free market should be constrained. When the government steps in and restricts corporations from requiring more than a 40-hour work week or protects otherwise able-bodied yet underage children from engaging in the American workforce, you are dealing with the tentacles of socialism's influence. And we could go on. Agricultural subsidies and big oil subsidies are socialist. So too is America's government-funded education system from pre-K all the way to higher ed. And of course, taxpayer-funded bailouts for big corporations are socialist, or at least the furthest solution from capitalism. The ban on denying coverage for pre-existing conditions in healthcare is socialism. Socialism is giving tens of billions of dollars in bailouts to farmers to make up for poor trade policies made by our government. Taking money from the American people to give as a handout to farmers is pure socialism. Socialism is the national highway system, the public roads and bridges built by the federal government with money taken from the taxpayer. That's socialism. The fire department, the police department, publicly funded libraries and parks, and on are all socialism, pure and simple. So as you head into the polls in 2020 with ruffled feathers about how America is sliding into socialism, just remember, we're already there. In the end, the capitalism versus socialism debate that will rage in prime time in the lead up to the 2020 elections is an entirely false choice. Like most other countries in the world, America is not fully capitalist and it's not fully socialist. Instead, America has a mixed economy. However, those who remain doggedly determined to rid the country of all socialism can perhaps set the example for future generations by giving up their socialist Social Security check and refusing their socialist Medicare insurance. That would make Ronald Reagan proud. Perhaps then we will finally see who's really against socialism and who is really for it. Go ahead, take the lead by setting an example. Who knows? Maybe someone can start a movement to end the growing threat posed by socialism simply by putting their money where their mouth is.
And they want to raid Medicare to pay for socialism.
Hey friends, this is Jerry Robinson from Follow the Money Weekly. Recently, we have been receiving many emails from our listeners commenting on the great help they're getting from our precious metals expert, Tom Cloud. Gold and silver are excellent hedges against the growing threat of coming U.S. inflation. Who's your gold guy? Make it Tom Cloud. With over 30 years experience with precious metals, Tom will answer all of your questions. Don't buy your gold and silver through some call center and pay inflated prices. Call my good friend Tom Cloud and speak directly with him and get all of your questions answered. For a limited time, Tom is offering free shipping and insurance on every gold and silver purchase made by our listeners. Call 800-247-2812. And when you do, tell him that Jerry Robinson from Follow the Money Weekly sent you, and he'll throw in that free shipping and insurance on your entire order. Call your gold guy, Tom Cloud, right now for the very best deals on gold and silver coins. 800-247-2812. That is 800-247-2812.
You follow drugs, you get drug addicts and drug dealers. But you start to follow the money, and you don't know where it's going to take you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's broadcast on the encroaching threat of socialism. We covered a lot of ground today in this podcast in a very brief amount of time. But as always, I like to leave you with a final word, and this time it's taken from the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, verses 35 through 37. It's an interesting passage. You know, many people who quote the Bible, and oftentimes they quote the Old Testament, they often cherry pick the things that they want to focus upon. For example, they'll point back to the Old Testament and point out how homosexuality is a sin, or they'll point out about how certain sins were atrocious back in these times. And yet they tend to also, many times, not all, but some, tend to ignore other verses from the Old Testament, such as this, Leviticus 25, verses 35 through 37. It says, "If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner or a stranger, so that they can continue to live among you. Do not take interest or any profit from them, but fear your God, so that they may continue to live among you. You must not lend them money at interest or sell them food at a profit." That's really quite stunning, isn't it? That's not a scripture that you often hear quoted from many different pulpits here in America. But indeed, the Old Testament has some pretty strict laws on usury, that is, interest. And in fact, today we find our entire world leveraged to the hilt, with interest payments coming out of our ears. What if we had listened to that verse? What if we had emphasized that particular verse from the Old Testament? What if usury was still a sin? And that's just something to think about. Remember, friends, when you want the truth about the global economy, just follow the money. Have a safe and prosperous week, and we'll see you right here next time. Until then, God bless.
All of the information contained on the Follow the Money podcast is strictly for informational and educational purposes. It should not be construed as specific investment advice. The views and opinions of our guests and sponsors, including Tom Cloud, are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of FTMDaily.com or Robinson Media Group, LLC. Jerry Robinson does hold an insurance license and at times may offer consulting on life insurance and fixed retirement income products. Follow-up, individualized responses to email or phone requests that involve the rendering of personalized investment advice for compensation will not be made absent compliance with state investment advisor registration requirements or an applicable exemption or exclusion and applicable insurance regulations. Past performance is not indicative of future results. You should be aware of the real risk of loss in following any strategy or investment discussed on the podcast. Remember, never do your financial planning through podcast or radio. It's your money. Be wise. Do your due diligence and always consult a trusted financial professional before making any financial decisions.